The sun was a painter, splashing hues of apricot and rose across the twilight sky. Emily, her blonde ponytail bouncing in rhythm with her stride, felt the familiar surge of energy that always accompanied her evening runs. Central Park, her sanctuary, was breathing a sigh of relief after the day's hustle, the crowds thinning to a gentle hum. She loved this time of day, when the city lights began to twinkle like scattered diamonds against the darkening canvas. The park transformed, shedding its daytime persona to reveal a quieter, more mysterious soul. The air was cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Emily had her routine down to an art. 3 miles, a loop that took her past the Bethesda Terrace, around the Bow Bridge, and back along the winding paths that snaked through the heart of the park. It was her escape, her meditation, her moment of solitude in the middle of the urban jungle. She'd been running this route for years, ever since she moved to the city after college. She felt safe here, even at night. The park was well lit, patrolled regularly, and always had a smattering of people. Dog walkers, couples strolling hand in hand, the occasional lone figure lost in their own world. Tonight, however, there was an unusual quiet. The usual symphony of crickets and distant chatter was muted, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck prickle. She glanced around, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes watching her from the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the trees, their silhouettes stark against the fading light, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. She told herself she was being paranoid. It was probably just the change in the weather, a lull before the city's nightlife kicked into gear. She picked up her pace, trying to outrun the unease that was creeping into her mind. As she rounded a bend in the path, she heard it, a faint sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. At first, she thought it was just the rustling of leaves, but then she heard it again, clearer this time. A cry for help. Emily stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper within the wooded area, off the main path. She hesitated, her instincts warring with her sense of caution. What if it was a trap? What if someone was trying to lure her into the darkness? But then she heard the cry again, weaker this time, laced with desperation. It was the sound of someone in real trouble, someone who needed help. Emily's heart went out to them. She couldn't just leave them there, alone and afraid. She thought of her younger sister, how scared she would be in that situation. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't at least try to help. She glanced around, scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. But there was nothing, just the trees, silent and watchful. Taking a deep breath, she stepped off the path, venturing into the undergrowth. The cries were getting louder now, guiding her deeper into the woods. She pushed aside branches, her sneakers sinking into the soft earth. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker. The sounds of the city faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Emily's fear was growing, but she pressed on, driven by a mixture of compassion and adrenaline. She followed the cries, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. After what seemed like an eternity, she came to a small clearing. The cries were coming from here. She was sure of it. She scanned the area, her eyes straining to pierce the darkness. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone there?" Silence. She called out again, her voice louder this time. "Can anyone hear me?" Still nothing. She started to feel a prickle of unease. Maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe there was no one here. She was about to turn back when she heard it again. A cry, muffled this time, as if someone had clapped a hand over their mouth. Emily froze, her blood running cold. She knew now that she wasn't alone. Someone was here, hiding in the shadows, watching her. She took a step back, her hand reaching for her phone in her pocket. But before she could pull it out, she heard a sound behind her. A twig snapping underfoot. She whirled around, her eyes widening in terror. She could see a figure moving in the darkness, their shape obscured by the trees. She gasped, stumbling backward. The figure was coming closer, their footsteps silent on the soft earth. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts scattered. She didn't know what to do. Should she run? Should she fight? Should she scream? Before she could make a decision, the figure lunged forward, their hand reaching out and clamping down over her mouth. Emily cried out, her voice muffled by the hand. She struggled, trying to break free, but the figure was too strong. They dragged her deeper into the woods, their grip tightening around her. Emily's fear was overwhelming, a wave of pure terror washing over her. She knew she was in danger, that she was trapped, that no one could hear her cries for help. She tried to fight back, kicking and scratching, but it was no use. The figure was too powerful, their movements too swift. They dragged her through the undergrowth, her clothes snagging on branches, her skin scratched and bleeding. She could feel the rough ground beneath her feet, the cold dampness seeping into her clothes. She didn't know where they were taking her, but she knew it couldn't be good. She was at their mercy, a helpless victim in their grasp. The figure finally stopped, releasing their grip on her mouth. Emily gasped for air, her lungs burning, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. She was in a small clearing, surrounded by trees. The darkness was complete, broken only by the faint light of the moon filtering through the leaves. She could see now that there were two figures, not just one. They were both tall and broad-shouldered, their faces hidden in the shadows. Emily's fear intensified, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She knew she was in serious trouble. The two figures moved closer, their eyes glinting in the darkness. Emily could see the outline of their faces now, their features twisted into menacing smiles. She knew she had to escape, that she had to get away from them. But she was trapped, surrounded by the darkness and the trees, with no one to help her. She was alone, at their mercy, and she knew that her life was in danger. The figures loomed over Emily, their presence radiating a chilling menace. The one who had grabbed her was taller, his build lean and wiry. The other was shorter, thicker, with an air of brute strength about him. They moved with a practiced coordination, like predators who had hunted together many times before. Emily's mind was a whirlwind of terror. She knew she had to get away, but her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat, a choked sob. The taller figure smirked, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low growl. "Look what we have here. A little lost lamb." The shorter figure chuckled, a guttural sound that sent shivers down Emily's spine. "Looks like someone didn't heed the warnings about staying out of the park after dark." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she was in serious danger. These men weren't just messing around. They had something planned for her, something that made her blood run cold. She tried to reason with them, her voice trembling. "Please," she begged. "I don't want any trouble. Just let me go." The taller figure laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Trouble is exactly what you're in, little lamb. You wandered into our territory, and now you're going to pay the price." Emily's mind raced, searching for a way out. She knew she couldn't fight them. They were too strong, too many. Her only chance was to escape. She looked around, desperately scanning the clearing for any sign of an escape route. But there was nothing. Just the trees, their shadows stretching out like grasping claws. The taller figure took a step closer, his eyes raking over Emily's body. "You're a pretty little thing," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "It's a shame we have to do this." Emily's stomach churned. She knew what they were going to do. She had seen it in their eyes, in their smiles. They were going to hurt her. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But then, she felt a surge of anger, a spark of defiance that ignited within her. She wasn't going to give up. She wasn't going to let them win. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking with the taller figures. "I won't make it easy for you," she said, her voice shaking but firm. The taller figure grinned, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "That's what they all say," he sneered. "But in the end, they always break." He lunged forward, his hand grabbing Emily's arm. She cried out in pain, her body twisting in an attempt to break free. But his grip was too strong, his fingers digging into her flesh. The shorter figure moved in, his eyes fixed on Emily's struggling form. He reached out, his hand clamping down over her mouth again, silencing her cries. Emily thrashed, her body writhing in their grasp. She kicked and punched, trying to land a blow, but they were too quick, too agile. They moved around her like shadows, their hands and arms a blur of motion. They dragged her deeper into the woods, her feet barely touching the ground. She could feel the rough branches scratching her skin, the cold earth beneath her bare feet. She knew she had to escape, that she had to find a way to break free. But her struggles were weakening, her energy fading. They finally stopped, pulling her into a small, hidden alcove. It was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The taller figure released his grip on her arm, his eyes lingering on her face. "Now, little lamb," he said, his voice soft and menacing. "Let's have some fun." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what was coming. She was trapped, at their mercy, with no hope of escape. The shorter figure chuckled, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He reached out, his hand tearing at Emily's clothes. Emily screamed, her voice muffled by the hand still clamped over her mouth. She thrashed, her body writhing in their grasp. But it was no use. They were too strong, too many. They had her trapped, helpless, at their mercy. The taller figure watched, his eyes filled with lust. He reached out, his fingers tracing the curve of Emily's jawline. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his voice sending shivers down her spine. "It's a shame we have to ruin that pretty face." He slapped her across the face, his hand stinging her skin. Emily cried out, her head snapping to the side. The shorter figure laughed, his eyes mocking her pain. He reached out, his hand tearing at her clothes again, ripping the fabric. Emily screamed, her voice muffled, her body trembling. She knew what was going to happen. She was going to be their victim, their plaything. But then, something inside her snapped. The fear, the terror, the helplessness. It all transformed into a burning rage, a fierce determination to survive. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let them break her. She was going to fight, with every ounce of strength she had left. She glared at the taller figure, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You won't get away with this," she hissed, her voice hoarse but firm. The taller figure smirked, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that," he sneered. He lunged forward, his hand grabbing Emily's hair. He yanked her head back, his fingers digging into her scalp. Emily cried out in pain, her body arching backward. But she didn't give up. She fought back, her nails scratching at his face, her teeth snapping at his hand. The shorter figure moved in, his hand clamping down over her mouth again. He pulled her closer, his body pressing against hers. Emily thrashed, her body twisting and turning. She kicked and punched, trying to land a blow, but they were too quick, too agile. They were toying with her, enjoying her struggles, her fear. They knew they had her trapped, that she couldn't escape. But they were wrong. They underestimated her, her will to survive, her burning rage. As they dragged her deeper into the woods, their grip loosening slightly, Emily saw her chance. They were distracted, their focus on each other, their guard down. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. She waited for the right moment, for the briefest lapse in their attention. And then, she struck. Emily saw her chance, a fleeting moment of distraction as the two figures gloated over their captive. They were so sure of their power, so consumed by their twisted pleasure, that they let their guard down for just a second. It was all the opening Emily needed. Feigning weakness, she slumped against the shorter figure, her body going limp. He chuckled, thinking she had finally given up. But as he relaxed his grip, Emily exploded into action. She twisted her body, using his momentum against him, and slammed her elbow into his groin. He doubled over, gasping in pain, his grip on her loosening. Emily didn't waste a second. She spun around, kicking him in the face with all her might. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his nose, which was now gushing blood. The taller figure stared at her in disbelief, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected her to fight back, let alone to turn the tables on them. Emily didn't give him time to react. She lunged at him, her nails raking across his face, leaving deep scratches in their wake. He roared in anger, his hand going to his injured face. Using his momentary blindness to her advantage, Emily dodged around him and sprinted towards the edge of the clearing. She didn't look back, didn't dare to stop. She ran as if her life depended on it, her lungs burning, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear them behind her, their heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. They were chasing her, their rage fueling their pursuit. Emily didn't know how far she had run, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She knew that if they caught her, she wouldn't survive. She stumbled through the darkness, her feet barely touching the ground. Branches whipped at her face, thorns tore at her clothes, but she didn't care. She had to escape. Finally, she burst out of the woods, stumbling onto the familiar path. She didn't stop running until she reached the park entrance, collapsing onto a bench, gasping for air. She looked back, her eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of her pursuers. But there was nothing, just the trees, silent and watchful. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, her voice calm and professional. 911. What's your emergency? I've been attacked, Emily gasped, her voice trembling. In Central Park. I need help. She gave the operator her location, describing the clearing where she had been attacked. She told her about the two men, their descriptions, their clothes. We're dispatching officers to your location immediately, the operator said. Please stay where you are. We'll be there as soon as possible. Emily waited, her body shaking, her mind replaying the events of the past hour. She couldn't believe what had happened. She had been so close to death, so vulnerable, so helpless. But she had survived. She had fought back. She had escaped. She was alive. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as the police cars approached. Emily watched as the officers arrived, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found her on the bench, her clothes torn, her skin scratched and bleeding. They rushed to her side, their faces filled with concern. Are you okay? One of the officers asked. What happened? Emily told them everything, her voice still trembling as she relived the horror of the attack. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. We'll find them, one of the officers said. We'll catch whoever did this to you. They took her statement, asking her questions about the attack, the men, anything she could remember. Emily did her best to recall every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. The officers promised her that they would do everything in their power to find her attackers and bring them to justice. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't find them. They were like ghosts, appearing and disappearing without a trace. She knew she would never forget what had happened that night. The fear, the terror, the helplessness. It would stay with her forever. She went home with her sister, Emily, who had waited anxiously at her apartment, frantic with worry when Emily hadn't returned from her run. Emily stayed with her for the rest of the weekend, a constant source of comfort and support. Sarah tried to put the attack behind her, to move on with her life. But the memories kept coming back, haunting her dreams, invading her thoughts. She couldn't run in the park anymore. The place that had once been her sanctuary was now a source of fear and anxiety. She avoided it altogether, taking different routes to work, different ways home. She started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, her body trembling. She would see the faces of her attackers, their eyes glinting in the darkness, their hands reaching out to grab her. She tried to talk to someone about it, to share her fear and her pain. But no one seemed to understand. They told her to forget about it, to move on, to get over it. But she couldn't. The attack had changed her, had shattered her sense of safety and security. She felt vulnerable, exposed, like she was always being watched. Weeks turned into months, but the fear didn't go away. It lingered, a constant presence in the back of her mind. Then, one day, she received a text message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words. I know you called the police, but I'm still here. Emily's blood ran cold. She knew who it was. It was one of her attackers, taunting her, letting her know that he was still out there, that he was watching her. She deleted the message, her hands shaking. She tried to convince herself that it was just a prank, that someone was trying to scare her. But deep down, she knew it was him. He was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to make a mistake. She didn't tell anyone about the message. She was afraid that they would think she was crazy, that she was imagining things. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She felt like someone was always there, just out of sight, their eyes fixed on her. She started seeing things out of the corner of her eye, shadows moving in the periphery of her vision. She would hear noises in the night, footsteps outside her window, whispers in the dark. She was losing sleep, her appetite was gone, and she was constantly on edge. She was a nervous wreck, her nerves frayed, her body tense. She knew she had to do something, that she couldn't live like this anymore. But she didn't know where to turn, who to trust. She was alone, trapped in a nightmare, with no escape. The text messages continued, each one more menacing than the last. They were short, cryptic, but they were enough to send chills down her spine. You can't hide from me. I'm coming for you. You're mine. Emily's fear grew stronger with each message. She was living in constant terror, her life a never-ending nightmare. She started having panic attacks, her heart racing, her breath shallow, her body shaking uncontrollably. She would feel like she was suffocating, like she was going to die. She tried to avoid being alone, staying at her sister's apartment as much as possible. But she knew that it was only a matter of time before he found her. She was living in a prison of her own making, trapped by her fear, her mind a battleground of terror and despair. She knew she had to face her fear, that she had to find a way to break free from this nightmare. But she didn't know how. She was lost, alone, and terrified. The final text message arrived late one night, when Emily was alone in her apartment. It was short, chilling, and to the point. Tonight. Emily's heart stopped. She knew what it meant. He was coming for her. She didn't know what to do. She was trapped, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She curled up on her bed, her body trembling uncontrollably. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. She heard a noise outside her window, a soft tapping sound. Her breath hitched. He was here. She waited, her eyes squeezed shut, her body tense. She could hear him moving outside, his footsteps soft and deliberate. She heard the sound of her front door being forced open, the splintering of wood, the crashing of glass. He was inside the house. She lay there, frozen with fear, her mind blank. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She heard him coming down the hallway, his footsteps slow and steady. He was getting closer, closer, closer. He was outside her bedroom door now.